Good morning, guys. Continuation of yesterday. Remember, what we're doing now is sort of bridging the gap between the Enlightenment thinkers who are questioning the way the government runs, the way the economy runs, where the judicial system runs, and the people starting to desire change. We've got to figure out what's going to bring these academic ideas down to the street level, which will produce the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. And what we have landed on is this idea that the 7 Years' War is really essential in that transition. Yesterday we talked about how it started off pretty badly for the British, even the colonists. Remember, Washington was embarrassed. General Braddock had a really failed campaign. There's other battles that demonstrate that things were going poorly for the British, but what we focused on was this transition under the leadership of William Pitt, when he gave the European theater and war over to Frederick the Great, and Frederick the Great of Prussia sort of handles Europe, and then he focuses on North America and promotes younger officers who will use more adaptive styles of fighting and more aggressive styles of fighting, and especially focusing on the major the main cities of the French Empire in North America, instead of worrying about the frontier forts attacking sort of the pillars of the French Empire. Today what I want to do is talk about one battle, just because I think it's really interesting, and then get into the important impact of the war as it's going to get the ball rolling sort of down the hill towards the American Revolution. So what we want to do is take a look at this Battle of Quebec. To be honest, there are battles that precede it that sort of are important in the storyline, but we have to be pretty succinct here. But there is this major fort that they had actually already captured, the British and colonists together, called Fort Louisbourg. And if we were in class together, we would sort of talk about that a little bit. But really, the importance of Fort Louisbourg is that it opens up the way down the St. Lawrence River towards Quebec. Now, Quebec is a very interesting situation because, as you can see here, it's pretty well positioned. Quebec is actually on a very significant cliffs. My family and I went to Quebec just a couple summers ago, and first of all, it's beautiful. You should try to go there. It's pretty accessible and cheaper than going to Europe, and it honestly feels a lot like being in France or somewhere like that. So definitely go there someday. But because it's on these cliffs, it's really, really hard to approach. And the other thing that you'll notice is that Quebec, as it juts out here, has commanding view of the approaches to the city. So that being said, it's very, very hard to approach. So what the British had settled in on was this idea of siege. You probably know what siege means, but siege is this idea of surrounding the city and sort of cutting off its supplies and making it have to eventually surrender. The British were having a really hard time executing this siege. It was going very, very slowly. Their morale was low. People were getting sick. So eventually, the commander of the British force, James Wolfe, this young officer who had been promoted by William Pitt, decides he's going to be a little bit more daring than just siege. So what he decides to do is, under the cover of night, he's going to sail sort of a detachment of the British troops sort of silently past the French and land back here at the Du Foulon. And what actually happens that night is his men scale the cliffs. Having been there, this is an impressive feat. In the cover of darkness, carrying their guns and actually even carrying a cannon, really up these very, very steep bluffs. He gets a significant force in behind Quebec. And the thing that's really interesting about this is, while this city of Quebec is up on these cliffs, it actually slopes upwards if you go away from the city. So the Plains of Abraham here, which is a battle site that you can visit if you go to Quebec, Um, this area, the Plains of Abraham, is actually higher than Quebec, even though Quebec is up on a cliff. And this gave the British a significant advantage. That meant with their guns, they could lob shells down into the city, although they had very little by way of artillery that early. But what the French realized pretty quickly is that they were going to have to come out and address the British presence there. And so a very famous British general who had been wreaking havoc on the British during this war, his name was General Montcalm, he will attack pretty much straight away the morning when he realizes what has happened. And he's going to basically attack what we call full frontal assault, straight on. And the British held their fire for a significant time, waited until the French were within 35 yards, and then fired 2 volleys that were apparently quite devastating. And these volleys were about all it took to break apart the French effort, and the French had to withdraw back to the city. Now, interestingly enough, in this moment, Montcalm was mortally wounded, as was James Wolfe. Both commanding officers actually die in this battle of the Plains of Abraham. That's heartbreaking and tragic, but the result of the battle is that the French realize they have to surrender. They're completely surrounded now. The siege will work, and the British have actual high ground over Quebec. So they have to surrender, and they do, which you can see happens in 1759. Shortly thereafter, Montreal also falls to the leadership of Jeffrey Amherst, the other officer that had been promoted by William Pitt. That actually pretty much signals the end of the major fighting in North America. There were still battles being fought in Europe and elsewhere around the world, but really what was left to do was actually to sort of pound out the peace treaty, which will be signed in 1763, signed in Paris, which is often the case. So this Treaty of Paris in 1763 is going to be really essential. It's why I call the 7 Years' War the cause of the causes of the revolution. Let's take a look. One of the things that you can see right away is the differences in the map. The French essentially withdraw from North America. That will go back and forth a little bit over the coming decades, but look at the area of green which Britain was granted based on the 7 Years' War. There's no more French. No more French threat on the frontier. The French are gone from Canada. It's all British now. But what I want you to focus in on is actually this red line. It's the proclamation line of 1763, based on a Parliament proclamation. And basically the idea was that Parliament was not going to allow British colonists to move west past that line. This led to all sorts of frustration. The British colonists had actually, remember, initiated the French and Indian War based on their desire to control that land that's sort of just out past the Appalachian Mountains there into the Ohio River Valley. That's why General Washington had gone there in the first place. And so now when the British are restricting their movements, they become very, very frustrated about that. And that's just one small aspect of the legislation that comes out of the French and Indian War that leads to growing colonial frustration. The kind of frustration that might have them listening to academics and philosophers and political scientists who are thinking about how should government really function. Their desire to move into the Ohio River Valley and that being denied by the British is one small impetus for the growing movement towards American Revolution. Think about this for just a second. This is 1763. We're a decade, just over a decade away from the first shots being fired from the American Revolutionary War. And so this window of events that happen here, all tied to the 7 Years' War, will all lead us really kind of downhill towards the American Revolutionary War. So let's kind of give an overview. One of the things that's true about the American Revolutionary War is that it would never have succeeded if the colonies weren't more unified. Imagine just Massachusetts trying to fight against the British, or just Pennsylvania, or just New York, or just Virginia. Now, those four are essential, but none of them could have done it alone. They had to be more unified. And that's actually one of the things that took place because of the French and Indian War. The colonists were interacting much more than before and more unified than they were before. In fact, there had been a movement by Benjamin Franklin to try to unify all the areas of the colonies in what he called the Albany Plan of Union. There had been this Albany Congress where they met in New York and they talked about what ways could they work together. Now, the Albany Plan of Union was not actually adopted. None of the colonists wanted to cede power or control over to a federal body at all, but it is an early sign that the colonies are working together to a greater extent. And then, of course, actually fighting together. The sense of camaraderie and unity that comes from being in the military together is significant. And beyond that, notice that the people of Massachusetts will be fighting with the people of New York together, right? They're not going to be as identified with their colonies as much as with their unified goal, right? That's going to be a moment where the colonies are going to become more unified. Another thing that unifies them actually is their frustration with the British, especially with the British military. The British military tended to treat the colonies and the militia poorly. For instance, Washington was demoted within the eyes of the British system. He, didn't have as much value. The militia was often given kind of the grunt work, the less prestigious work, and were often disparaged in a military sense by the British professional soldiers. And so there was tension there. And beyond that, there was also more British troops being sent to the colonies and then stationed there after the war through the Quartering Act, meaning the colonies themselves were having to pay the price for the British soldiers being there. But they were frustrated. They say, wait a second, the threat is gone. We don't need more soldiers. The French are gone. Why don't we have less soldiers than before rather than more? But what's an interesting side note here, well, I shouldn't say side note, maybe it's an important ingredient, is this idea that the militia saw up close that it is possible to beat the British military, even if they're the best in the world. Even if they're the most powerful nation in the world after the 7 Years' War, they could be beaten. They had seen it happen at various forts and in various battles. Moreover, what they saw is how to beat the British. There's a certain sort of confidence that comes out of the 7 Years' War that there's a way to frustrate the British. And the colonists had seen it with their own eyes. They had seen the French and the Indians actually wreak havoc on the British strategies. This is a sense in which the colonists sort of learned the playbook of the British during the war. Now, remember, there's also frustration about the Parliament Proclamation. But lastly, as we're wrapping up here, there's going to be a lot of taxes that come out of this war. It's an expensive war, and the British are going to basically ask the American colonies to handle a third of the cost. There's ways in which that's not unreasonable. It's not a terribly tyrannical decision by the British government, but what's going to happen is these taxes are going to be leveraged without the active consent of the American settlers, the colonists. Up to now, in the colonial history, the tax laws had generally been mutually agreed upon or specifically decided by the colonial governments. But now the British are going to take a much more active role, and they're going to be leveraging taxes like the sugar tax or then the Stamp Act. Then you're going to see tax systems like the Townshend Acts come forward, and one after another, the colonies are going to be frustrated by those tax codes and laws, and there's going to be a growing sentiment of frustration. These taxes are due to the French and Indian War, but cause the frustration that leads us closer and closer to the American Revolutionary War. And that's what our focus is going to be on. What is it that brings the frustration of the colonists to a boiling point, and how does that relate to Enlightenment thought? I hope you have a great Easter weekend. God bless you.